Welcome to the Underhive Workshop. I am Goblin King. In this episode, we are continuing down the bloody road to Mordheim. In a few episodes, we're going to look at scratch building the old Warhammer Fantasy Battle Watchtower. If you remember that, it was a pretty cool plastic kit. In order to get ready for that, today we are going to look at how to make some stone field walls for use as scatter terrain. And that'll be a way for me to lay out a couple of the different things that I do to cut like stone bricks and stuff like that out of XPS foam. However, before we get started, do you want to connect with us? Join us over on the Jim Dark Gaming Discord server. We're building a community around Warhammer 40k, Age of Sigmar, Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and other miniatures and tabletop role-playing games, as well as covering a lot of world building and creative writing in both fantasy and science fiction universes. Unlike the last set of scatter we made, today we will be using a much thinner material for the base of these builds. This way, these pieces can be more set flush with a game mat or put anywhere onto an existing terrain board. As always, I try to make all of my terrain pieces as modular as possible. That way they can be used more like building blocks and less like set pieces. For this build, we are going to be focused on building a 6-inch by 1-inch stone field wall section that will provide light or half cover, something a player could have their characters take cover behind. We will also be looking at a 3-inch by 3-inch corner section that will connect to it and allow you to expand. The aim with all of these is to make these field walls about 1 1/4 inch in height. All right, so let's go over our cut list really quickly, and then we will jump into tools and material. So for our cut list, we are going to need at least 2 to 3 6-inch by 1-inch pieces. And then we're going to need at least 2 1-inch by 3-inch by 3-inch pieces. There'll be a corner. So you'll cut a 3-inch by 3-inch, then we'll come in an inch, and then we'll make this notch. On to tools. So for tools, we will be using our square, a utility knife, always good to have a hobby knife on hand, like always, a couple of different writing implements, sanding stick, although that may not be as useful in this one, and tacky glue. You're also going to need a container of some sort, because as we cut our XPS bricks, we're going to put them into a container with a couple of rocks and shake them around to damage up the corners and kind of give them a little bit of texture. As far as a container, I'm going to use this container that has a nice layer of aquarium rocks at the bottom. I'm going to throw all my XPS foam bricks in here, and then I'm going to give it a really, really hearty shake when we're at that texture depth. As far as materials go, we're going to need a bunch of XPS foam. I have a bunch of XPS foam scrap from various projects, so that's what I'm going to focus on using. And you're going to need some either 2 or 3 millimeter plastic card. Just like last episode, this is plastic card that I got from one of those odds and ends kits from Evergreen Plastics. Really, really handy to pick up. Suggest you grab a couple. XPS foam, really easy to pick up at a store like Lowe's or Home Depot, but you can also order sheets online. This stuff is pink because it comes from Home Depot. I know that the Lowe's brand is blue, and I know that a couple of the other brands vary in color. I would suggest using XPS foam just because it's a little bit thicker. You know, you could, in theory, use regular expanded styrofoam, but regular expanded styrofoam often has, in my opinion anyway, a little bit more of like a concrete texture to it. so it doesn't necessarily work really well for this. It's got other applications, and we'll actually talk about using some recycled styrofoam later, because I think styrofoam is a great thing that you can use for hab blocks or big stone walls and stuff like that for Warhammer 40K or any other post-apocalyptic science fiction dystopian game setting. Stargrave definitely could use it. You probably use it in Space Station Zero. Lots and lots of different science fiction post-apocalyptic games could use styrofoam. We'll get to it a little bit later, but other things that you're going to need for this build are going to be moss. This is just craft moss that I picked up at Michael's several years ago. And I know I keep kind of harping on this, but I buy this stuff in the largest packs possible because then I don't have to go out and buy it all the time, one. And two, it's usually, in general, a little bit cheaper to buy the giant bag of it and just have it forever. And you're also going to need playground sand or sand from your backyard. Any prepared sand. I prefer just to buy sand online, again, in like a 10-pound bag. I realize it's a free material depending on where you live, but I feel that buying it in a 10-pound bag, one, serves me for years in all of my terrain building, and I don't have to worry about sand sizing. All right, so on to laying everything out. We're going to lay out our bases on this thinner material. We're going to cut it out, and then we're going to move on to the XPS foam bricks. All right, now we're going to cut our XPS foam. And to do this, we're going to cut a couple of different sizes. The first size we're going to cut is going to be 1/4 of an inch by 1/4 of an inch by 1/2 inch long. The next one we're going to cut is going to be 3/8 by 3/8. And that one's going to be 3/4 of an inch long, so that's going to be a little bit bigger. And then we're going to cut 1/4 of an inch by 3/4 of an inch bricks. So we're going to get kind of a longer, skinnier one. So here is what that 1/4 of an inch by 1/2 inch brick looks like in comparison to a miniature. Here's that larger brick that's 3/8 by 3/8 by 3/4. And then there's what that 1/4 by 1/4 by 3/4 looks like. So we get a little bit of variation in size, and we're just going to cut a bunch of these guys. The easiest way to cut the small ones, the 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch by 1/2 inch, is to lay out everything in 1/2 inch increments, and then go ahead and cut your entire material down its length. You can get your blade nice and out to its full length. Once it's cut to that length, you're going to mark your 1/4 inch. You're going to find 1/2 inch again. 1/2 inch in this case is pretty much half. Then you're going to want to mark off each 1/2 inch this way. And then each of these just needs to be quartered. And as precise as I am at the beginning, as I'm cutting them out, as I get to the smaller and smaller sections, I start being a little bit more, I know I need to quarter them. I know that these all need to be rough cut at their lengths, and I'm not necessarily worried about the ruler anymore. And the big reason for that is these are bricks or stones that would have been hand carved out in the fields. The masons are working on them as they're plugging them into the wall. They're not going to be perfect. They don't even need to be perfect, realistically. You're going to get a much better end result, in my mind, if they're all a little off. You're going to get weird little gaps. You're going to get pieces that you have to fit together right. You're going to get areas where, a little bit of extra glue and some moss is going to really stick well the way you want it to. But that's the trick. For all the other sizes, I'm basically going to do the same thing. I'm going to make all of my larger, rougher cuts, and then when I get down, I'm going to start quartering things out. And I'm just going to cut a buttload of these little bricks. So I'm going to cut out all those different bricks in varying sizes, and then I'm going to shake them up. I'm going to shake them up to get some rough edges. And you'll notice that I threw some bolts in there, some nuts in there. There was obviously the little tiny rocks in there as well. Depending on what you're going for, you can put in some larger rocks. You'll get better or larger damage. And that will be something that we'll do next time. But for this one, I was kind of looking for a little bit subtler of an effect. There's definitely going to be some there, but it kind of suggesting like a harder stone. And the reason for that is I'm kind of trying to go for a look like Hadrian's Wall. And Hadrian's Wall is in the United Kingdom, and it was built by the Romans to separate the northern territories from the southern territories. There's a lot more of a history lesson there, but that's kind of the summation for the terrain building tutorial. But it has a very, very cool, rough look. I really think it's a very, very neat, very, very cool look. So it was something that I kind of wanted to hint at with this particular build. And that's why I didn't really worry about all of my stones being the exact same size. And as I'm piling them together, as I'm putting this wall together, I'm not really necessarily worried about it being super uniform. I want to kind of imply that it's been here for maybe a couple of 100 years or maybe a couple of 1,000 years. Maybe stones have been pulled from it for various farm projects of the locals, or maybe they've been brought back because it was needed as another defensive structure, or maybe even this is something that orcs or goblins built or something like that. I just think it has a very cool ancient look, and that's kind of what I'm going for with this one. When we do the tower build in the future, we'll cut a lot of very, very specific same sized bricks, and that build will be a lot about doing kind of precision or more medieval precision style, more medieval precision looking pieces. We're kind of going for the height where a miniature is almost hidden behind it. A 32 millimeter miniature is almost hidden behind it. And whether or not that's a D&D miniature or whether or not that's a Warhammer Fantasy Battle miniature is up to you. I'm going to come in with a wet paintbrush and just clean up and move some of the glue around, move it into a couple of the cracks that it might need to be into, and then just make sure that there isn't a bunch of excess where I don't want excess. Just be patient and careful with white PVA glue when you're doing something like this because, none of this is dry or stable yet, and it's not going to be dry and stable for probably 24 hours. It's just one of those things where you kind of lay it out, and then you come in, you clean up what you can, and just let it sit and dry. Again, pull out any glue that you don't want to overpower your texture. There is a step that we can do, that we will do right before we finish it, right before we Mod Podge cover it to paint it, where we'll roll a piece of tinfoil along the exterior to give it a little bit more texture. So you don't necessarily have to worry that much, but there's a straight wall segment. It's very, very random. Lots of little gaps, lots of little pieces, and find something that you don't like. Like I just saw this little tiny gap that I'm not a huge fan of. I'm just going to see if one of my random pieces can plug it. Looks like that piece might do it, but it's a little tall, so I'm just going to shave it down and fit it in. These are little mascara sticks, makeup sticks that I got on Amazon. They're great for cleaning up super glue or pressing little details in. There's another little gap that I'm not a super fan of, so this other little piece that seems to fit right in there. Got a couple other little gaps, but overall I'm pretty happy with how this looks. I'm trying to make sure that the wall is pretty much in the center. And again, the idea behind this wall is to give it that more ancient, built 900 to 2000 years ago look. Obviously, this same technique, if you make all of your bricks the same size and you lay all your bricks alternating, you get a much more uniform look. But that wasn't what I was going for. That's not what I'm going for with this particular hedge set. I'm going a little bit more for that ancient Hadrian's Wall look. And this one side so the important part is that since I'm going to make this modular, I do want one side to butt up. So I'm going to push everything down and make sure it butts up. And if it comes a little bit off, that's fine because I can shave it later. I can shave it down later after it's dried. I can shave off whatever's missing. But the whole idea would be this next piece, this corner piece that I'm going to lay out right now, would just be right there next to it. And I'm going to make sure that I get what I want by kind of lining everything up and putting a couple of lines, construction lines down before I apply any glue. So I'm going to want it to go about there, and since it needs to be modular, the other side is also going to need to match up again right about center, which is what I've got. Oh, there we go. Moving on to the corner. All right, so we've given these guys a little bit of chance to dry. Just make sure that that glue's nice, set up. Looking over them, I've got a couple of holes and gaps, and I have a way that I'm going to fill that. Show you guys how to do that, and also start doing a little bit of the basing. And then we'll set those aside again and let them dry. And then we're actually going to come back and do some painting and finishing on these guys, because I want to show how I use moss to kind of tie everything together. And this is my end piece, so it doesn't go all the way to the edge. But again, you know, setting it up for modularity. So my little guy can go there in the center. Obviously, I'd make another set or maybe 2 sets of these if I wanted to make an entirely enclosed space. And bricks like that overlay just a little bit. We're just going to trim through the base so they fit well. Trim like that. There we go. All right, for this next step, I'm going to mix glue and sand together to make kind of a thick textured paste. Now, you could use something like Vallejo light texture or something like that for this as well if you wanted to, but I kind of wanted to play around with an older method that I used to do when I wanted to get a textured paste. I wanted to show this method because, again, this is the way to do it with Elmer's glue and sand, relatively cheap materials. So I'm going to use a sculpting tool as well for this. So it's always good to have a bunch of these around. They help for sculpting clay. They help for cleaning some stuff up. You can clean glue. You can clean glue and edging up with them, and you can also obviously use them to like sculpt green stuff and stuff like that for miniatures or clay itself. But in this case, we're just going to mix our gooey concoction together. Basically, you're almost looking for kind of like a thick mud or a really wet flour or a wet bread dough mix. Almost like concrete in a lot of ways. So I might mix some more glue into this. I might not. Kind of going for a workable consistency. Something that's going to stick when I spread it. I'm not going to have to necessarily worry about it dripping down or getting out of place. That's pretty good. Again, I know it's not super precise. It's just how does it feel? Does it feel about right? But, sand castles, mud pie, we all made that stuff as kids. So we're just kind of looking for a consistency that feels moldable. I used 1 spoonful of sand, and I'm going to use all of the sand for this, so I'm going to add in a little bit more glue here because I'm getting a little too dry. So once I got my sand paste to about where I want it, I'm going to go and I'm going to specifically pack it into some of these holes. And this particular tool has a thicker end and a skinnier end. This is a tool that I use to do lots of texture pasting with. I will put a link to them, but they're dental or metal sculpting tools, depending on how you look for them and find them. But I'm just going to push that grout, essentially, into those tiny little holes. The whole idea being, of course, that there's sand or mud or dirt, old grout, old mortar that was actually put in between these guys. And I'm only going to do it in the big gaps. I'm not going to worry about filling any of the little small ones. If I get a little bit of runoff, if I'm spreading it in, that's fine, but I'm not going to specifically go in and fill everything. So I don't have quite enough of it left over, but another thing that you can do is you can use some of this for ground cover for basing too. Something to watch out for as I'm loading it up here on my thumb, it's getting drier faster. It's actually turning into set glue with just sand on it. So just be aware if you're going to use that method. It's just based on how I work. I've always used my hands, even when I was in college, going through my illustration major and doing like oil painting and acrylic painting in classes. I always used my left hand as kind of a palette. So it's just a weird thing I do. You don't have to do it. But the stuff that was loaded up on my thumb did get drier. It did pull away kind of a little bit from the overall material, and I wanted to use it a little bit in basing too, so I'm loading up a little bit more sand. There's already some glue in there. Some leftover glue in there. I don't want to shoot a bunch of air all over it, or just shoot sand, loose sand everywhere. So I'm just going to mix up a little bit more of that same concoction, and then I'm going to spread it along the base of the stone walls. So if you were in a pinch and you just wanted a paste that you could put on the base of your minis, this is stuff that you could definitely use as well. As I'm looking at moving forward with more of these tutorials and trying to point out little steps like this that can be used, little techniques like this, little tips like this that can be used in other places. So I could take, a 32 millimeter base. In fact, this warrior's base, even though he's painted, doesn't really have any texture on it. So if I wanted to take that texture out, I could just spread a little bit. These bones bases are not bones figures. A lot of times come on like a little pre-form base, and I just glued that down. But I can just spread this in. It works nicely with that pre-done bones base. It gives a little bit of texture. It gives a little bit of melding. And it's going to blend that out a little bit better. Then all I have to do is match the paint job on the base, although I think I only did a base coat on this. Sometimes getting ready for D&D night, you're in a rush. But, it does the same job. Its intended purpose is to be kind of like a textured grout or a textured paste. So because of that, it's putting a bunch of sort of ground effect into that miniature's base as I do it. And it's the same mixture. I didn't change anything. This is still just glue and sand. And you can thin it out if you want to. You can add a lot more water, or you could do the traditional method where you just coat the entire base with glue and then you dip it in sand. This stuff is just a different way to do it. It can give a little bit more control if that's what you're going for. The main reason I'm doing it in this case is because I already had it mixed up, so I'm gonna try to use all of it up. But in this case, I'm gonna spread it along the bottom. What I would normally do is paint some glue along this edge and then sprinkle it with sand. And since I've got this stuff already at hand, I'm just going to spread it into that bottom corner and bring it down off as much of the brick as I can. I'm not going to necessarily worry about getting it to the edge, but if a little bit gets there, a little bit gets there. That's how I'm going to base texture these, at least for step one. And this could be it. You could wait for this to dry, Mod Podge it to seal everything in real nice, and then paint. You could even mix some gray paint into your Mod Podge, so when you paint it, you're getting your final color all in one go. But I'm actually going to use moss and probably a little bit of grass style flocking on this build. So this really is just that transitional texture, that mud, that dried out, nothing's necessarily growing, that barrier that fences and stone walls get, where there seems to be a little bit of dirt right before the stone wall. There's kind of that little barrier of less vegetation. This texture is going to imply that for my build. All right, so these guys have had a little bit of time to dry. I've gone ahead and cleaned up the table a little bit. I'm keeping all of these extra bricks, all this extra stuff that I want. Even the sand here has had a time to dry. So the first thing that you can do is any of the excess that you don't like, you can just kind of wipe off with your fingers. I did a little bit of that yesterday. It's really not stuck that hard, but as you can see, it's nice and into those gaps. It gives it a nice, like, mud, so to speak, mortar look, which is what I was going for. But this is the first tutorial where instead of saying, join me in a future video where I show you how to paint these, I'm going to go ahead and paint these now. And the reason I'm going to do that is because the very last step I want to use to really make these pop is to add moss to them. That was one of the things that I brought up in the beginning. So I really want to show what that looks like all the way through. So for painting, what we are going to need is we're going to need Mod Podge. So Mod Podge is a matte sealant. One of the things that's important about Mod Podge is it's kind of like a glue. It's kind of like a really thinned down Elmer's glue. We'll probably thin it down even a little bit more. Cup of water, obviously, because we're painting. A palette. For my palette, I'm going to use a paper plate just because I've got a bunch. And then I have an assortment of old brushes here. And these are brushes from other projects. They could be old brushes. These are some old tank brushes from way back in the day when I used to have a bunch of Astra Militarum or Imperial Guard forces. These are my tank brushes. These are basically just all old brushes. Some of them are cheap synthetic brushes. Some of them came from other projects. Some of them were even things that I used in art school that I've just managed to keep around. The two things that I do with brushes like this are, one, I use them on painting terrain, and two, they end up becoming dry brushes for different things. This is actually a old Citadel dry brush. So probably wouldn't be the one that I would use in this one. An old shade brush, old Citadel shade brush. So it's just that the important part here is I tend to keep old brushes that are sort of falling apart and sort of at the end of their life, or not necessarily in a place where I want to save them and keep them specifically for painting terrain. None of these are that new. Don't worry, I didn't destroy a bunch of new brushes specifically for this purpose. Some of this green brush has literally been around with me for like the last 25 years. I think this tank brush is from 99, or maybe it's this tank brush is from 99. One of these is from like 99. One of them is from a couple of years later. None of these are new brushes. None of these are the things that I use in primary painting. These are just, as brushes get old and they get kind of past where you think they might be savable for painting tabletop miniatures, I save them specifically for painting terrain. Now, the second big tip that I have for painting terrain is don't use your nice Citadel paints or your nice model paints. So these are Artist Loft paints. They're from Michaels. I just pick them up in various different colors. I usually grab them when they're having a sale. But to go over the essential paints in a way, white and black are always super essential. Artist Loft has a metallic black, which is pretty nice. It gives a little bit of a metallic sheen if you're going for that. Yellow, ochre, and burnt sienna are very, very good colors. These can be mixed together to make very, very good Mars-looking bases. Mars colors, the piece of terrain that I showed earlier in another video. That was a 3-story building that had been done. That had been done with both of these. One of them is the base and one of them is the dry brush. Gray, always a good color to have. There's metallic whites too, which can be used for different things. And then I just step up my shading or saturate my shading a little bit to each direction. I even have a metallic copper. So all sorts of good colors that you can pick up and really just kind of pick up what you want. For these, actually, we are going to be using, first off, a gray to coat our stones with our primary color, and then we're going to be using a burnt sienna to do the ground. And I have an open burnt sienna, so we'll use that. But again, just a little tip. I'm not using super fancy model paints. for base coating, I'm just using acrylic art paints. You got to treat them a little bit differently. We are going to thin them down a little bit more so they're a little bit closer to what a model paint is. Acrylic paints are thick in general, just because of what they are, what they're used for. These would be intended for being painted onto a canvas. So they come out a little bit thicker, almost like a paste. And we're going to do our base coat and Mod Podge at the same time. So that's what Mod Podge looks like. It just looks like a glue, basically. We're just going to add a little bit to our gray. Good big brush. We're just going to mix our color up. Another tool that you probably want on hand when doing this step is obviously going to be like paper towels or something like that. But the primary tools, or the primary things being used, are Artist's Loft paints, which I would get at Michael's. Try to include a reasonable alternative down in the show notes from Amazon for you guys. But it's basically just a basic acrylic paint. I'm also not going to really worry too terribly much about trading out my paint buckets. I would have a paint washout for metallics and a paint washout for solids, and possibly even a third washout pot if I was doing bright non-metallics and dark non-metallics if I was painting miniatures. But for this, I'm not going to necessarily worry about it. If I end up using a metallic color, which is pretty doubtful, I would just be using the same paint pot. So Mod Podge is going to thin out that paint a little bit, and then I just added a couple of full brushes of water, give it a mix around. Same consistency rules, obviously, for painting miniatures. You're just using a little bit more volume as far as how much paint is on your palette, how much paint you're putting down at one time. So you're going to kind of go by your gut. So I'm going to focus primarily on painting all of the stonework, just really, really roughly. Hadrian's Wall is not different coats of gray. It's not a dark gray and a light gray. It is kind of some browns and all that mixed in, and we'll be doing the same thing. And with 2 coats of sealant on those guys, gray sealant on those guys, I'm going to move to doing the bases. And for the bases, I'm just going to do burnt sienna. This time I'm not going to mix in the Mod Podge. I'm just going to choose kind of a clear area of my palette. Try to get as much gray off my brush as I can. Again, get a little bit of water mix in there just so it's not super dry. And then I'm going to come in and paint the bases. Not really worried at this point about getting it up onto the bricks. The gray is a lot more of kind of a base color and a sealant color. I just sort of want to know that the sealant's on it Burnt sienna is a good base color for dirt. I was going to layer some browns up, make a brown from here. It'd be great if I wanted to go with a Mars looking ground. This would be a great base that I would just start dry brushing right on top of. But for this case, it's just a nice base color to kind of get the first level in. If you're going to do something like dirt or a more natural ground cover, this is going to give that reddish tint that dirt actually does a lot of times have. One of the things I learned when painting in college was, you can move directly to a peach or a skin tone right off the bat, but oftentimes it's a really good idea to put down a red or a reddish hue as a base when you're painting skin tones. Light is actually going in and bouncing off of multiple different layers, which makes our skin color. And as to where that's a good example when it comes to skin, that's kind of true of a lot of material. A lot of material is bouncing or reflecting or absorbing certain light. That's why it looks the way it does to us. And dirt is one of those things that there's lots of layers to it. There'd be lots of little tiny individual grains and all sorts of stuff like that. So starting off with a reddish hue and then building up to a darker brown definitely gives, in my opinion, a more natural feel. So onto my secret weapon when it comes to painting terrain. I'm going to use washes, ink washes, but I'm going to use my own ink wash. So this ink wash is made from 4 drops of black India ink, 2 drops of brown India ink, water, a little bit of flow improver or airbrush cleaner depending on what I have on hand, and then a couple of drops of dish soap. Now, I store it in this big plastic container, and I just give it a hearty shake and then a stir before I'm going to use it. That does make a bunch of soap suds because I am using a couple of drops of dish soap to give it more of a wash consistency to basically keep it nice and runny so it doesn't just dry or so that stuff doesn't evaporate out of it. However, really easy to combat that, and that's just to use an eyedropper, go right in underneath the suds, and then put it into whatever you're going to paint from, be it a dry palette with a bunch of different segments, or I have a tendency to use old lids a lot. It just gives me a pretty big wealth, and I'm just going to slapper it all over these. It's going to get into all of those recesses just like a normal ink, and it's going to kind of start that process, that weathering process. I'm going to do it a couple of different times. Come back and hit the base. Everything is in a stage still where it's quasi-drying, so I'm kind of mixing everything together right now, which is fine because I want that muddier look, especially down here at the bottom. One of the things that's really nice about this wash technique is if you've got clean water, which I don't have, and I wouldn't be doing for a Mordheim or fantasy build anyway, but if you've got clean water and you're working on a sci-fi build, you can come back in at the top and you can just paint with direct water along the top, and it's going to give it kind of like an acid wash, almost like rain, acid rain look to it, where it leaks down and causes a bunch of streaks, griminess, which I really like. In this case, I'm just relying on it itself to do that streaking and grime, but it definitely pops immediately. I start to get a little bit of definition. So the reason I'm wet blending is because I am trying to mix all of these different colors together. If I had waited about 15 more minutes, I would have had a nice dry base and I wouldn't be kind of creating this muddy transition between the gray of the bricks and the burnt sienna of the ground. However, I don't want these bricks to necessarily be gray, so I'm going to start playing around with mixing those colors even now, even early on into this. And, you know, a lot of this is about playing around and experimenting with how you want it to look. Obviously, start with a destination in mind, but be willing to kind of screw around and figure out what it looks like. Just like when I make the builds themselves, I'll have a roadmap, but I do get to a certain point where I start kind of winging everything. The same thing, I've got a roadmap with paint. I definitely want this gray base, and obviously I want this kind of murky, dirty ink. But the more I play around with this paint job, the more I'm mixing in all of those different colors on the bricks. It's getting me really nice and set up for my dry brushing, which will come in next, which will start to pop some of the more of the color that I actually want onto everything. I like my ink to be relatively liquidy because then it can kind of run down as it naturally would. As rain would hit this object, it's going to kind of come in and it's definitely going to drag that grime and that streakiness to those corners. And you're going to get that ink, you know, that shade settling in those corners anyway, because that's kind of what the shade step's all about. But it's also going to pull it down irregularly along the path of least resistance that actual water would take. So any extra grime or grit that would come from exposure to the real world is going to happen. That's going to kind of happen for you, which I find very gratifying. Then again, we'll let everything dry. So next, as everything is getting a little on towards further dry, I mixed in a little bit of red ochre with that remaining burnt sienna that was already on my palette, and then I put in some black to get myself a nice muddy looking brown. I'm going to reduce that with some water to get kind of like a thin shade, not necessarily a glaze level, but pretty thin. And then I'm just going to go in and paint on top of where I already put the burnt sienna down for the base. And this color is also going to be the base for the dry brush color, we're going to apply all over the bricks in a second. In some places, the ink is a little bit thicker, and I'm going to, again, just go along with it, mix it in a little bit. It's going to make some of the application a little bit darker. It's going to give variation, which is exactly kind of what I want. Constantly making sure that I'm washing my brush and getting a little bit more water into this paint, just to make sure that I get the consistency that I'm looking for. I'm using a little bit finer of a brush too, because I'm being a little bit more choosy about how I apply it. Still not super worried if it runs up onto these bottom bricks. Again, these bricks are going to get dry brushed with this same color here in a second to start the process of making them stand out a little bit. And 2, these are the bricks that are at the bottom, so they're going to have the most dirt, the most local gunk on them, so to speak. This color will be a good future foundation for adding a little bit of green to. I would just mix a little bit of green into it, and then splotch green onto these bases in a couple of places where I'm either going to glue down moss or where I'm going to glue down grass flocking. It's important when mixing colors like this to either mix enough for the project you're working on so it all kind of matches, or to get pretty good at tone matching, paint matching. This is essentially probably 3 parts ochre to 4 parts burnt sienna, with 2 parts black added after those are mixed together. But again, if I were to mix this batch up in the future, if I wanted to make another entire set of these, which I probably will, I would just take the base and kind of color match as I mix. Or when you know that you're going to do a huge modular set, mix your colors once and just kind of have them there. With terrain, it's nice to have everything match or be within the same color environment rather than exactly looking like the same bottled paint. And a lot of that can happen when you add in either the flocking or the details like the moss. The moss is always going to be a consistent color. The flock is always going to be a consistent color. My wash is always going to be a consistent color because it's a recipe that I just duplicate and use over and over and over again, and those things are going to unify the different pieces of terrain together, even if the dirt, so to speak, on one chunk of wall doesn't exactly match the dirt on the chunk of wall that it's next to. You can also paint the bases at this point, or not the bases, but the rims of the bases at this point if you want, or you can leave that for later. You can paint them brown, you can paint them black, you can paint them gray, you can leave them white. I'm going to put a little bit of brown on them. It's probably more important, in my opinion, to get comfortable mixing and matching paints than it is to get the recipe right each time. But there is no reason that says I shouldn't be keeping down a recipe list as I do this. Just like painting miniatures, I should write down how many parts of each I use so I can get kind of a consistent brown, especially if I really like it in the future. And this is something that I've been mixing for a while, so I just kind of know it. Kind of know by eye what I want. Plus it's terrain, so we just, Bob Ross approach a little bit. There are no accidents. It's just happy little additions and changes to the project you're working on. Not even happy accidents, happy additions. I always grab a certain set of colors, but a lot of these acrylic brands, especially as you start looking at acrylics meant to be used on canvas, or even acrylics meant to be used for like crafting, home crafting stuff, you know, whether or not you're painting a wood sign or something, a lot of them do have other colors. You know, there's a brown, there's a forest green, there's a crimson red, there's all sorts of other stuff that exists in those lines that you can just grab. So it's just as easy to go out and grab a brown that you think you're going to like and just always use that. I just have a tendency to want to mix a lot of my colors, and one of the reasons for that is I never really know what board I might be trying to match, or whether or not I'm trying to match a board. Maybe there's a battle set I've already painted or something like that, and I kind of want to go back to that same color that I've used a bunch, which is actually more along the lines of why I do it. So again, this is going to be the same color that I dry brush. I'm just going to dry brush some of that brown in, and this is the darkest of the dry brush colors we're going to do, so we're going to do it first. So to dry brush, you're going to load up your paintbrush. You kind of want an old, kind of frayed, bushy brush. You're going to load it up with a bunch of paint or some paint, and then you're going to wipe the majority of it off onto a piece of tissue. Sometimes I use my hand as a palette, like always. And then you're just going to very, very quickly and lightly go up and down on the surface. Now, unlike painting miniatures, I'm being a little bit more aggressive and leaving a little bit more paint on this, because I'm actually trying to get a lot more paint onto the piece that I'm doing. As I do successive dry brushes, as I go back and lay in gray, for example, and then possibly even go up and put in some tans and stuff like that, I'm going to be a lot lighter and a lot choosier. But this is a good overall tint, I guess, is what I'm going for. I want to tint all of those gray cobbles this kind of old brown color. Not cobbles, but blocks. And if I find exposed edges where maybe a little bit too much of the undercoat or even the glue kind of wore off, not glue, base coat wore off, I'll actually hit it with just a little bit of a darker smudge. Just get it all going. Make sure to turn it all around, because there's all sorts of little nooks and crannies when you build it like this. None of these blocks are the same height, so there's a good example. A little bit of the pink SPS foam was popping through for some reason, so I just went ahead and covered it with a bit of a thicker. And again, as I build the next couple of layers of dry brushing, a lot of that will kind of get taken care of. Alright, time to add in a little bit of green to get that base I need for the flocking and moss. I'm going to mix it off to the side because I still need some of this brown. I got kind of a olive-ish color. Make a good base for everything else. And wherever I put this is going to be where either flock, grass ends up, or where moss gets attached. So I'm not going to necessarily do everything. And while I'm here, I'll go ahead and grab some of this stuff and just touch up any areas that feel like they need it. And also blend in a little bit. And drag that green and that brown back and forth into each other. A little bit of wet blending. When I first got into playing miniatures games and painting miniatures, a lot of the techniques that I would read about at the time or see in some of the White Dwarf publications back in the 90s, I would go ahead and try the technique first on little tiny terrain builds. And that way I was using paint that I wasn't worried about wasting, and I was using and I was working on pieces that I wouldn't be worried about needing to repaint. And that's definitely something that you can still do. You know, find a little tutorial thing that you like on YouTube, or even an official Warhammer Plus, or finding other commissioned painters who teach classes, like friend of the show Kaylee Larson, or any of the other painters or streamers that are out there. If you want to try their technique and you want to do it in a way where you're not necessarily feeling like you're hurting a model that you're working on, make a little piece of terrain. If it worked for me in the early 90s, mid 90s, reading a magazine article, it works today. For my next dry brush layer, I'm mixing that black and gray together to get a darker gray. This will probably be a two-stage. I'll probably do one of this, and then I'll come back in with a little bit even lighter gray. Just add a little bit more gray into this again. Mix it again. And then keep going. Unlike the last dry brush, I'm really going to be a lot more traditional this time. As far as dry brushing goes, I want to leave just a little bit. Start breaking up and bringing out color. I'm going to be careful to not get it on any of the green that I just painted. Pick out a couple of bricks, dab them real well with color, then get back to a dry brush and grab a streak and grime away from it. Little tiny variations, pulling out color here and there. There we have it. At this point, I could come back in, I could put in another layer of my wash, and then when that wash was done, I could do another dry brush of gray, a lighter gray, just to make some of the edges pop a little bit more. But this very much has that old lava look, old lava stone, I guess, look that I'm trying to go for. Really wanting mine to kind of match what's in my head of Hadrian's Wall, as far as some of the pictures that I've seen online. So my color is right where I want it. So next up is to flock over the green areas with some just normal flock. I'm not going to use static grass for this. I'm just going to use some normal grass flock. And then when that's done, I would add, or I will add, my moss bushes where I want them kind of growing up and over. So last little painting tip for the day. If you find yourself, like I do, with a couple of colors that I like that I'll probably keep using on another set of these field stone walls, just so I've got 6 corners, 6 straight pieces. I might even make some arches and some entryways. And I'll do another roundabout with this where we'll actually do some detailed corners with like braziers or something on top of them, and then maybe some arched entryways and stuff like that. But if you find yourself with a little bit extra and you don't know what to do with it, or you want to keep it, you can put it into a gallon baggie, a gallon Ziploc baggie, and then you can add some wet paper towel in there. Go ahead and seal it up, and then leave it in a cool, dry place. And then leave it in a cool, dark place, not a cool, dry place. Obviously, you just added a wet paper towel to keep moisture in it. But just like, it'll act basically like a kind of temporary wet palette in a way. It'll keep enough moisture in it that the glue won't dry all the way, and then that'll allow you to pull it out the next day or a couple of hours later and keep using it. Now, the only thing that I would say is warn your partner or your roommate about this. You know, let your husband, boyfriend, girlfriend, everybody know that you're doing this, so they don't just open up the fridge, so to speak, and find a plate that looks like it's covered with various states of mold in it. Just warn them that you're putting some paint in the fridge if you're putting it in the fridge. Here where I'm at, I can just go ahead and do that and leave it underneath my painting desk right here because it's nice and cold. So the very last things we're going to need for this is going to be some sort of ground cover flock. I have this Scene Masters ground cover dark green. I've had this for years. It's one of those things I picked up at a hobby store and just kind of keeps to be moving around with me. I'm going to attach it down with PVA glue and then just sprinkle it on, and it's going to stick where I want it to. Then, as we mentioned in the beginning, a bunch of moss. Those will be used for bushes and some extra detail around the base of the walls and kind of coming up and over the walls. All right, so to do the flocking step, first we're going to put a piece of paper underneath everything because we're going to be sprinkling the flock all over stuff. That way it's easier to clean, and it's going to be whatever's reusable is reusable. Get out one of these 99-cent impulse buy packs of paintbrushes I got at Michael's. And then I'm just going to put I'm just going to put the glue on top of where I painted green yesterday. As I spread it out, I might go over a little bit on each side, up onto the wall just a tad, and even just take some of the extra glue and move to the next piece. Thankfully, Elmer's glue specifically, as a brand of white glue, is kind of meant for crafts, so it has a tendency to keep its tackiness for a bit, so you do have some working time. You don't have to immediately apply whatever you're trying to glue down. I normally do because I'm moving on to the next piece, but in this case, I can get the glue nice and spread on several different pieces, and then once that's done, hit them all at once. Just like basing with sand, and flocking is kind of similar, and it's chopped up little tiny pieces of felt, or at least this flocking is chopped up little tiny pieces of felt. So it's going to sprinkle on a lot like sand, and it's going to stick really, really fast. And then I can make the decision as to whether or not I want to layer up on it. Do I want to do a second layer? Do I want to keep it as just one layer? With these two pieces pretty applied, so a lot of these flocking come with a sprinkle top like you'd see in spices or something for cooking. Sometimes they work, sometimes they get clogged pretty easily. Shake back and forth, flock the crap out of it, get rid of all that excess. That leaves me with some nice ground cover. It adds a dimension of color to the build, so the build is no longer just some drab grays and browns. There's now a color that makes it pop. I'll just repeat for all these different pieces. When you open these bottles, make sure that you keep these caps, so they're not open and able to spill out when you don't want it to. All right, and the last little step is to add some bushes. So I've got two different types of moss here. I've got this really thick stuff, which is what I'm going to use for this build, but this set also came with this thinner stuff, which is good for like Death World, shrubbery, or if you're making ghillie suits or stuff like that. We'll definitely talk about this in the future, but this is the thicker stuff, the cloudier stuff is what I'm going to use today. That's probably a big enough chunk. I'm just going to rip it up into some pieces that look about right. I definitely want it kind of growing up and over the wall in a couple of places, so I dab my glue on. I'm just going to hold it in place for a couple of seconds. And there it is. And I'll just set it aside to dry. And this stuff can be really absorbent, so as you saw that piece fell off, I kind of had to rework it back in. Just use a little bit more glue and be patient with it. If you like these tutorials and found any of these tips or tricks helpful, leave us a like and consider subscribing. We're trying to release a few terrain tutorials a month, and I'll be back in the future with tutorials that are focused on painting some of the pieces that I have built here on Underhive Workshop, both in the Bloody Road to Mordheim and Urban Warzone series. Need something to listen to while deep into a painting jam or a hobby session? Check out our podcast, Under the Hive of Madness. We are on Spotify, Apple, Google, and many, many more. You can subscribe to us and all the content we make through Patreon at www.patreon.com/underthehiveofmadness. Find links to our podcast, Patreon, Discord, and much more below. Thank you for joining me on this build. Together, we can keep building towards something awesome.